want to pick up where we left off the other day. We were still going over the history. We've kind of done a little bit of Shakespeare stuff. Let me start with this. Not because it's greatly important, but it is important somewhat to understand a mere scattering of an introduction to the Bible in English, especially as it pertains to Shakespeare, okay? Because for most of Shakespeare's life, he only had one, maybe two versions of the Bible. And those two were the Geneva Bible, published in 1566, and the Bishop's Bible, which is slightly different, published in 1568. Go back to the earliest form. The Bible originally is written in Hebrew, Old Testament, Hebrew. That gets translated into Greek around 150 BC. That Greek version is called the Septuagint. That's the version that Jesus and the disciples, etc., all cite. When they refer to the Old Testament, they're referring to the Greek version of the Old Testament, not the Hebrew version. Okay? When Jesus quotes the Old Testament, he's quoting the Greek version. When Paul quotes the Old Testament, he quotes the Greek translation. Okay? Let me go on. That then, the Old and New Testaments then get translated around the 5th century, I think it's the 5th century, into Latin by St. Jerome. It's called the Vulgate. It's Vulgate because it's common Latin. It's not high fancy. It's the everyday Latin of everyday Latin speakers, okay? The Bible gets translated into Old English during the period roughly 700 to 1100, but only portions get translated into Old English. Portions of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, for example, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, parts of Daniel, parts of Ezekiel, etc., and parts of the New Testament, all of the Gospels, for example, get translated. Okay? Go up a couple hundred years, the Middle English period. John Wycliffe, all right, translates parts of the Bible into Middle English. This is the 14th century. This is a no-no, by the way. This is not allowed by the church. Okay? Wycliffe and his followers are called Lollards, Lollards. They're kind of persecuted. Chaucer alludes to them. The book I mentioned the other day, The Vision of Piers Plowman, by a guy named Lyman or Lawman, they allude to the Lollards, etc. Jump up to the Renaissance, or what's also called, and I like the term Renaissance better, but the early modern period, 16th century, beginning around 1500 or so. A man named William Tyndale translates the New Testament into 1526. Translates it into English in 1526. Okay? Another Englishman, Miles Coverdale, translates the entire Bible into English in 1535. If I remember correctly, and I may not be, I'll have to check it afterwards, Tyndale's persecuted. I think he dies in prison. Coverdale does die in prison. Henry VIII is the one who persecutes him. Coverdale flees to the continent, flees England. They're both Protestant, by the way. That's why they're translating the Bible into English. Okay? Henry VIII persecutes him for doing that. But then he takes Miles Coverdale's Bible and tries to pawn it off, essentially, as his own. All right? Geneva Bible gets published in 1566. That comes to be called the Great Bible. It's kind of the widely recognized as the best English translation, better than Coverdale's. I've skipped a few. These are the major steps, let's call them, okay? The Bishop's Bible then in 1568, and then in 1611 we get what is called today the authorized version, okay, that is instigated by King James I of England. James fancied himself a biblical and theological scholar, all right? And what he does is he gets together 3 groups of men, 3 groups of biblical scholars, Cambridge, Oxford, and London, if I remember correctly, sets them up there, and they each translate. I think the story is, it's been a long time since I've taught the history of the Bible. They each translate the entire Bible, so you get these 3 kind of separate translations, and then they bring those together. And that gives us the King James Bible, which is widely regarded, even today by people who don't give a rat's you-know-what for the Bible, as the greatest translation in the English language. It encapsulates this golden era language. One thing to be aware of, the language of the King James Bible is not the language of everyday, ordinary people living in England in the early 1600s or late 16th century. So, my cup runneth over. They wouldn't say that. They would say, my cup runs over. They wouldn't say, he who hath a will. They'd say, he who has a will. That is, when they translate the Bible in the King James Version, at the time they're translating, they're hearkening back to an older, kind of archaic form of the language. Why? It's to kind of distance it, to make it more, to give it more of an aura, make it more holy, so to speak, right? When Shakespeare quotes from or alludes to the Bible, he's doing this one. The Geneva Bible. Why? He doesn't have this one. He doesn't have the King James Bible, except for until you get to The Tempest and King Henry VIII and a couple of other, maybe 1 or 2, Love's Labour's Lost, or My Two Noble, one of the ones that's written into after 1610. Okay? So that's kind of a little important thing to keep in mind. I've had students before, they want to look at Shakespeare's use of the Bible and they pull out something like the New International Version. You can't do that. Or they pull out, you can't pull out the King James. Okay? Because the King James, for example, here, translates the Old Testament based on the Hebrew text, what's called the Masoretic text. Oldest version of the Hebrew Bible is 9th or 10th century. We've got portions of the Septuagint from before Christ. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, give us, for example, parts of Isaiah, early forms, right? So, from there, go away. Why am I getting all these spam calls? Let's go to this, because I had this on the board yesterday right here, and I'm going to go over each of these letters, and then we're going to do this, and then get to actual Shakespeare. TULIP, because what did Martin Luther do in 1517 that I mentioned 2 days ago? 95 Theses, church door in Wittenberg. Okay, because Gutenberg had invented, for all intents and purposes, the movable printing press, not where you could take the press from one place to another, but movable type. Okay, those 95 Theses get printed and widely disseminated. Then Luther keeps writing stuff, and that gets spread. You have the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. I did not have on the board the other day a man named John Calvin. We call him John Calvin. Okay? Calvin kind of likes what Luther has to say, but he thinks Luther's wrong in some of his theology. Calvin is the father of what is called Calvinism and the Calvinistic doctrine. Okay? The Reformed Church, the Presbyterian Church, all come out of Calvin. Calvin wrote 2 massive volumes, 1536, called The Institutes of the, I'm going to abbreviate, Christian Religion. What that means is the doctrines of the church. Okay? He's not going back to the early church fathers and stuff and the creeds of the church and coming with the doctrines. This is Calvin's analysis of the scriptures, coming up with what he says are the doctrines of the church. I need to throw three other things up here. Where am I going to put them? Where I can reach. All right. Calvin's theology, I used to be a diehard Calvinist. I mean, my nickname at school, went to a Presbyterian school, was truly Reformed. I mean, I'm not anymore. I'm Orthodox. Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, icons, bowing, praying, incense. Calvin would burn me at the stake for all of that. Anyways, Calvin's theology can be summed up, and has been summed up, by this acronym TULIP. T stands for total depravity. All right? Which I need to put up another phrase. I had it up yesterday, Tuesday. So if you still have the notes from then. Total depravity. That is, everyone born on earth, doesn't include Adam and Eve, because they're not born. They're created directly by God. Everyone born on earth is tainted by sin. All right? And sin touches every aspect of our lives. That is, there's nothing we can do that is good. Absolutely nothing. So even when we do the most altruistic thing, that act is somehow touched by sin. You help a little old lady across the street. Well, you're doing it out of the kindness of your heart, but also, other people might see you, and it makes you feel good. That's pride. Deadly sin. Okay? Total depravity. U, unconditional election. Unconditional. God elects certain people merely because he wants to. Okay? There's nothing you or we or I do to merit that election. And all election means is God says, you are saved, the rest of you go to hell. In Calvin's theology, the vast majority of humanity goes to hell. Very, very few make it to heaven. Right? L, limited atonement. That means Jesus didn't die for everybody. He only died for those who are elect. Okay? So even though St. Paul says, even though he died for all, and God wishes all men to be saved, he didn't really mean it. That's code language for, he means for most people to be, or some people. And one of the things Calvin does is he introduces, I shouldn't say introduces. He does what, and I'm not knocking Protestants or anything, what a lot of Protestants are really good at, what are called proof texts. Well, I've got this Bible verse that when we get in an argument, I just, and I spit it out. Because it says, before the foundation of the world, the elect were chosen. That is, before anything was created, God in his mind's eye, who knew exactly how everything was going to happen, said, you get saved. And the rest you go to hell. Okay? So, limited atonement, Christ died only for the elect. So if you're not one of the elect, his death doesn't mean anything to you. I, irresistible grace. Grace is God's favor upon you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you is an Old Testament blessing. Notice that grace, however, which is a gift, is irresistible. What does irresistible mean? You can't fight it. I thought you said find. You can't fight it. You can't deny it. So if God chooses Sarah, no matter what Sarah does in her life, she can't go, well, yeah, you, God. Won't happen. Okay? Why? Because she's been elected already. Last thing, P, perseverance of the saints. So even though you might be totally depraved, God has elected you His Son has died for you. He has shown his irresistible grace upon you. And because of those four things, you will persevere to the end. Persevere. You will overcome obstacles, or you will endure those obstacles without renouncing your faith. Okay? What did Jesus famously not do on the cross or in the Garden of Gethsemane? You know, he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, Father, let this cup pass from me. And then what does he say? Not my will, but thine, yours be done. He doesn't say, no, I'm not going to do this. Crucifixion is the most horrible way you can possibly die, which is why the Romans did it. And they did it for the worst violators of Roman law. Okay? So, that's Calvinism in a nutshell. Lutheranism and Calvinism are the two main driving forces of the Protestant Reformation. Okay? One of the things that comes out of those, Calvin believed in sacraments of a sort, but not sacraments, things that conveyed grace, which is what the Catholic Church taught. That is, you go to the communion meal, you go to church, and communion is celebrated, and you take the wafer and you drink the wine. You are, in Catholic theology, taking into your body the blood and body of Christ. That is imparting grace to you. Calvin said, no, it's not. It's merely a memorial celebration. It's a commemoration of an event that happened. It doesn't physically or spiritually do anything to you. Catholics, Orthodox say, no, it does something. It physically alters you, etc. Catholics introduced the doctrine of transubstantiation somewhere in the Middle Ages. I don't remember the exact year because I don't think there is an exact year. It just kind of develops. Aquinas, Sir Thomas Aquinas talks about it, where, and we're going to talk about this briefly, the wine literally becomes the blood of Christ. And the bread literally becomes his flesh. Which means I have to bring up two more terms. Accidents versus substance. Okay? This is important in Shakespeare, actually. Accidents and substance, two different things. The accidents of something, of anything, is its appearance, what it looks like. Okay? This, for example. What am I holding? A shirt. Okay? That's its appearance. What is its substance? Cotton. Or, depending on the, polyester or whatever. Its substance is cotton. What about this?
Tree.
Accidents is paper, substance is tree, cellulose. Okay? This, accidents is phone, substance, God knows what, oil, lithium, all the stuff that goes into it. So, what something appears is not what something is. And according to the doctrine of transubstantiation, the bread and the wine maintain their accidents. They look and taste like bread and wine. Their substance, however, is what gets changed to flesh and blood, which is why when people take communion, they don't taste skin and they don't taste blood. Okay? Pretty important thing, because I had written down right here on Tuesday this phrase, real presence. There was a big debate throughout the 16th century. This was, I don't mean big just like in church circles, big, publicly, broadsides, Broadsides are sheets of paper like a modern day newspaper opened up. Broadsides were published and distributed, sold on the streets, that argued, is the body of Christ really in that piece of bread? Is his blood really in that wine? And where you fell on that equation could literally determine whether you lived or died. People were taken to the rack in the Tower of London because they argued the body and blood is physically present in that stuff. I mean, they were executed for their theological beliefs, okay? Tulip, Calvin, etc. Go back for just a moment to the total depravity. Where did Calvin get the idea of total depravity from? A North African bishop in the early church, St. Augustine, was from the town of Hippo. Augustine's late 4th, early 5th century, like, I had the dates up, I think, 350 to 430, something like that, okay? And Augustine read the scriptures, and Augustine had his own background. Before he became a Christian, Augustine was like Hugh Hefner of the 4th century. I mean, he was known, if it moved, he slept with it. Okay? His mother, St. Monica, prayed continually for him, like, Lord, lead my son away from his dissolute ways and such. Read Augustine's Confessions, because they talk about the kind of life he led, how he converted, etc. Right? But Augustine read the Old Testament and read certain passages in it, and he came up with the idea, or what's called the doctrine of, I don't have it up here anywhere, original sin. Original. What does that word original mean? What word does it derive from? Origin. The origin of sin. And what Augustine taught, and this becomes the doctrine of the Catholic Church, and it also becomes the doctrine, even though Protestants say, we're not Catholic, of the vast majority of the Protestant church. Augustine taught that original sin and the concomitant guilt is passed down from parent to child, to child, to child, to child, etc. Well, how does it pass down? How do children inherit things from their parents? Keep going. Keep going. How do being born, genetics, how's that passed down? You got to have sex. Okay? So, the act of sexual intercourse gets tied together with original sin. So that, to see how this can get misconstrued over time, the medieval Catholic Church taught, if you're going to have sex, you have to get married. If you don't get married, you can't have sex, period, okay? But if you're going to get married, you should have children. Why? Because the Old Testament has all kinds of things about having children and being blessed with your children and such. That's all cool. In fact, the church says more children the better. But, and here's the big, huge, mind-blowingly awkward, strange but, don't enjoy the act of producing children. The enjoyment of sexual intercourse is tied to original sin. Okay? Read Chaucer's Wife of Bath's Tale. Because she's like, well, the hell with that. Mm-hmm. She's had 5 husbands. She's kind of like the woman at the well in John's gospel that Jesus meets, the Samaritan woman, who's had 5 husbands. And Jesus tells her, yeah, and the one you're now with isn't your husband. She's like, oh my God, he knows, And it's because he says, yeah, it's because I am, All right? So, sex is tied to original sin. Catholic Church takes that hook, line, and sinker. So you're born sinful. And remember I said tied to that is guilt. So you're born sinful and you're born guilty. So what happens if you're born and you die 2 weeks later? What happens to sinful, guilty people? They go to hell. Where are we? We're in, I don't know where we are. What's over there? Over across Middle Tennessee Boulevard, I'm all mixed up. Where now is the Human Resources and Graduate Studies office. In that building used to be Middle Tennessee Baptist. And they used to have a bus parked out front. And the bus, somebody told me once, told me recently, the bus is still painted this way, that the bus had painted on it red and yellow and orange flames. And a slogan, something like, it's rather long, pulling souls out of hell one at a time. Okay, what does that phrase presuppose? What is the assumption that it is based upon?
That you're already born sinful.
And
then going to hell.
In hell. Your soul's already, you might be up here living life, but your soul, you're already burning. And it's our job to take you out. You know, the phrase turn or burn kind of a thing, right? Orthodox don't believe that at all, by the way. Orthodox don't even use this phrase. We call it the ancestral sin. That is the first sin. But we don't believe people are born guilty. We believe, or we say, you're born into a predisposition towards sin. How do you know? Take a baby, take two babies, born 3 years old, put two babies into a little playpen with one toy. Yeah, I mean, just a little, what does it mean? Two go in, one come out, you know. It's going to be a cage match. That's kind of how we are, all right? So, that's where the doctrine of original sin comes from. Shakespeare plays with this notion of original sin a lot. And he plays with the idea of regeneration, of transformation. St. Paul talks about the old man, the new man. We're going to see an As You Like It. We're going to have an old man. His name is Adam. And he's a servant to a young guy. And that play is largely about transformation. Going from the old man to the new man. Hamlet's going to talk about the old stock, the new stock. When he tells Ophelia, get thee to a nunnery. Why? Because you'll breed sinners. He's talking about this. The play is very much Catholic, Protestant wrangling in a non-Catholic, non-Protestant setting, language and such. Okay? So real present, I've talked about all that. Real briefly, there's a motto for the Protestant Reformation. The three-phrase motto. Sola Scriptura, sola fide, sola gratia. Sola Scriptura, Scripture alone. Luther was the first person to translate the Bible, Old and New Testament, entirely, okay, into the native language of the people. He did that before Coverdale and before Tyndale. All right? Why? Because Luther said, if you have the Bible, and that's it, no priests, no church tradition, okay, and if you had faith, sola fides, faith, sola there doesn't mean sola, it means alone. Scripture alone, faith alone, grace alone. That's all you need. You don't need a priest to act as intermediary between you and God. If you have the scriptures, you can figure it out. Okay? So he comes up with that. He must, in coming up with that, he's doing that against something else. The church, Catholic Church, medieval Catholic Church, said, no, you can only come to God via a mediator, a priest. I mean, the ultimate mediator is Christ, the great high priest. You gotta have another priest, okay, to do that. And it's not just faith and grace alone, you also have to have works. Remember the other day when I was talking about the big bank account Christ created by suffering, dying, being resurrected? all the merits he earned that then can get transferred via indulgences and such. Okay? Well, Luther said that's a bunch of hogwash. You can't do anything to earn your salvation. In other words, you don't have to do anything. Literally. All you have to do is believe. Just believe. Calvin, it was essentially the same way. Theologically and, let's say, culturally, more important than the theologically, what's the problem with that? And what's the problem with one person along with the Bible can find the truth about God and the way to God? Well, there's 12 people in here. What does that then mean? There's 12 ways. Is it, hey man, this is my truth, as opposed to the truth? So, yeah, it does. And what is the end result? What is a end result of Luther and Calvin in the beginning of the Protestant Reformation? Anybody know how many different, I can never say this word so that I pronounce it properly, sects, not sex, of Protestantism there are today? It's like over 25,000 different, I like to just call them flavors of Protestant belief. Why? Because anybody can set him or herself up as a Protestant, because it's me and the Bible, man. That's it. Well, which version of the Bible then? And how do you get the Bible? See, the Bible for Christians is not like the Quran for Islam. What's the difference? Anybody know? A lot of translations. The Quran cannot be translated. Why? It was dictated directly to Muhammad. That is, there was no interpretation going into that. Muhammad just... So the Bible is, the words on the page are entirely sacred. That's why Muslims get so angry when someone burns the Quran. It's burning the holy word. Most Christians are like, if somebody defaces the Bible, yeah, it's just a book. Because it wasn't produced that way. Go back to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, there's a lot of books that are considered holy, sacred, etc. They're not in the Bible today. You know, go back to these. Some versions, a Catholic Bible, for example, for the Old Testament, will often include all the older books of the Old Testament that are not included in Protestant Bibles. The Book of Wisdom, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Bel, Susanna and the Dragon. I mean, there's a slew of things. Okay? New Testament's all the same. It's all the same. Luther, where is he? Somewhere. Luther wanted to exclude a book of the New Testament. The book of James. My saint is James. Why? Anybody know what James is about? What James emphasizes more than any other biblical author?
Talks about works.
Talks about works. Faith without works is dead. In other words, works, being kind to others, giving a cold drink to others, is what? It's proof of faith. Because anybody can say, I believe.
Even the demons believe and tremble.
Even the demons. And St. Paul says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, okay? So these are all issues that are just washing across the sands of the 16th and early 17th century. So that's done, that's done, that's done. That's done, did that. Let me do this real quickly, and then we'll get to Shakespeare's dates and maybe the first page or two of A Midsummer Night's Dream. I'm going to ask you to do something. For the remainder of this course, I'm going to ask you to attempt to do something. When you walk into the classroom, when you open one of the plays, imagine it like this. You're going to take off your 21st century lenses. And you're going to put on these lenses, 16th century lenses. That is, you're going to try and understand the plays as they were written in the time they were written. If this were a constitutional law class, this would be what's called originalism or textualism. What did the text mean at the time it was written? What is Shakespeare saying to his contemporaries? And you got to get that. Then we can extrapolate to today. Because a lot of these words, they've got a lot of different meanings that we don't have for them today, or that we don't use for them today. So, this part is conceptual framework. This is what the vast majority of people in Shakespeare's day believed about the world. Okay? Let me start with this. Great chain of being. The phrase doesn't come from Shakespeare's day. The phrase comes from John Dryden, 100 years after Shakespeare's death. 70 to 100 years after Shakespeare's death. And what Dryden means by that phrase, and he just uses it to describe a belief system that was already there. Okay? Wonderful, wonderful little book. You can get it on Amazon used. The Elizabethan World Picture by E.M.W. Tilliard. Okay? Which gives you all of this. Another wonderful one for like the medieval worldview. C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image. Notice, it's an image that is no longer held, but it's an image that held for 1,000 years, at least. So E.M.W. Tilliard, the Elizabethan world picture, goes into all this. The great chain of being. Everything that exists that is created. Notice the qualification. Okay? Every created thing, from the highest of the angelic orders, according to this worldview, to the very lowest, least significant thing of existence, a speck of dust, okay, exists on this great chain. Now, what characterizes the chain? No. Links. What happens if you break a link? The chain is broken, and the things beneath the broken link scatter and fall apart. Hamlet is going to use this imagery in one of his speeches. Okay? So, everything from the highest angelic order down to the lowest. Why do I say created things? God is not part of this great chain of being. God is, according to theologians, pure being. God is entirely other being. Okay? We can't use the same kind of language to describe us that we describe God. Why? Because the language that we use is based upon what we can see here. God's outside that picture. All right? So, within this chain, there are then orders. Right? Hierarchies. That's a word that 21st century people do not like to use, most, or hear. So, the angelic realm. The angelic realm has its own hierarchies. According to Paul's writings and in some of the early church fathers, there are 9 ranks of angelic beings. The highest of those, these two kind of flip back and forth depending upon your source. The cherubim and seraphim. Usually the seraphim are the closest to God. And then the cherubim, and then you go all the way down. Paul talks about powers, thrones, principalities, dominions, etc. Down to the lowest, everyday, common, ordinary, peasant level angel. What does angelus mean? Anybody know? Messenger. That's all angels are. They're messengers. They bring word from God to us. Okay, they're, divine text. Right? What comes after the angelic realm? Anybody take a guess? Us. What comes immediately after us? So you have the angelic realm, you have the human realm. Immediately after the human realm, you have the animal realm. Notice where we are. We are between the dumb beasts and angelic, supernatural beings. That's why you will hear in several of Shakespeare's plays language about, listening to our better angels, that part of us that ascends upwards, rather than our baser instincts, those things down below us. We're going to see in King Lear, one of the characters thinks we are nothing but walking, talking beasts. Why? Because we're governed by our animal appetites. Meaning two appetites, food and sex. Okay? And Lear is going to have this great comment about why we need more than food and sex in shelter. Okay? So, and then that goes all the way down. So I already talked about within the angelic realm, there's a hierarchy. There's the highest form. What about in the human realm? Who's the highest human? Think 16th century England. Who's the highest person, greatest person?
King.
King or queen. Okay? Beneath that, you get the various levels of royalty and aristocracy. Dukes, barons, earls, etc., down to the lowest level of humanity. By the way, this image is in Chaucer. The whole Canterbury Tales are predicated upon to have this ranking. The first person who tells a tale in Chaucer's Canterbury Tale is the knight. Why? He's the highest order of all the people. The lowest person who tells a tale is the final one, the plowman. He's a peasant. He's the lowest order of humanity. Okay? And then beasts. What's the king of beasts? The lion. What's his name? Leo. Means king. Okay? What's the king of birds? The eagle. King of the ocean. Whales. Why? Generally because they're the biggest. All right? All the way down to the lowest. So you have this great chain. Tied to that, kind of, is what's called, according to Tilliard, a doctrine of correspondences. That is, things that happen out there in the unseen world, the world we don't see, have ripples into this world. Okay? And we're going to see that almost immediately in this play. And let me take a second to take you out of Shakespeare and go to something written in the late 20th and early 21st century that does the exact same thing. The Harry Potter novels. J.K. Rowling's brilliant the way she does this. Because Harry Potter novels are set where? Two locations, right? Our world, number 4 Privet Drive, and Hogwarts. Hogwarts is kind of our world, but not quite the same. And she does something in the 5th book that really brings us out. She has Harry sitting in his kitchen with his aunt and uncle, and they start to talk about the war that is brewing. And his aunt, who is the most straight-laced, in one sense, Calvinist person there is, even though they're not Christian. I mean straight-laced. She doesn't allow for anything outside the ordinary. She suddenly mentions something about Harry's world that he had no idea she knew about. And the narrator says, and suddenly the two halves of Harry's world blended together. And I think what Rowling is doing here is she's talking about the spiritual world in the material world. And they are not separate. We think they are because we don't see the other side. Except for every now and then, glimpses. Read Wordsworth, Intimations, Ode of Immortality. or intimations of immortality. Okay? So this correspondences idea is that things that happen in the spiritual world have repercussions, actions out here. The basic biblical conflict. Satan wants to be like God, wants to rise above God. God throws him out of heaven. What's the repercussion? That's why the temptation of Adam and Eve occurs. Okay? So, things that happen in the supernatural world, like the world of the fairies, has repercussions here. When we get into the play, what do we find out pretty soon once we meet Puck? How are the king and queen of fairies getting along? They're fighting. How should a husband and wife get along? There should be peace and harmony. There's not peace and harmony. And what does that do? That affects the human realm and even the natural realm. That's why crops are dying. That's why there's fogs when there shouldn't be fogs. That's why there's cold in the summer and warmth in the winter. Why? Because the great chain of being has been rattled. The link between husband and wife has broken. How do we know? They're not sharing the marriage bed. Husband and wife do that for too long, one's checking out pretty soon, okay? This and this are tied together. Anybody know what happened in 1610? A lot of things happened in 1610. What major thing? What major scientific revolution, so to speak? It wasn't really a revolution. It was just kind of a nail in the coffin of a revolution. Galileo published his findings, proving Copernicus and his theory about the revolution of the heavenly bodies was right. Revolution meaning the movement. Copernicus said, based upon Kepler before him and the other guy whose name is slipping me at the moment, Czech astronomer, said the earth revolves around the sun. Prior to that, prior to Copernicus and Kepler, it was thought the sun revolves around us. We still use the language today. What do we call when the sun peaks over the horizon, and what do we call the other side when the sun dips over the horizon? Sunrise, sunset. Sun's not rising, is it? That's the rotation of the earth. Notice, it is a discarded, I'm going to use Lewis's language, it is a discarded image. Scientifically we know what the truth is, but we still use the language. Why? Because it best describes our experience of reality. You can stand there on a meadow and watch as the sun comes up. And what does it look like? It looks like the sun is rising. And you can follow it all the way the other way, okay? The older system, called the Ptolemaic or geocentric, Ptolemaic comes from a Greek, not astronomer, can't remember, philosopher, named Ptolemy, before Christ, long before Christ, a couple hundred years before Christ. He came up, meaning he described how the universe worked. And the universe worked by the sun revolving around Earth and everything else revolving around Earth. We were at the center, he said, of these spheres. So think of Earth as like my fist here, and then there's another sphere that goes around that, and another one around that, and another one, and there are a total of 9 of these spheres. Aristotle alludes to these even before Ptolemy, okay? And these spheres move, and these spheres are governed by intelligences, okay? Outside the spheres, it's what's called the Empyrean. That's where God or the divine dwells. Read Dante's Divine Comedy and you get the most beautiful description of this in the Paradiso, all right? Because it describes heaven. So you have Earth, immediately around Earth is what? What do you see at night? The moon. Okay? Everything from the moon to Earth is changeable. It's mutable. It's not permanent, right? Nothing here is permanent. I can't, pick up the phone and talk to my parents. Why? They died several years ago. We can't pick up the phone and talk to Abe Lincoln because he died 100 years ago, okay? Over 100 years ago. Everything down here is changeable and impermanent. Everything out there is unchangeable. Yeah, and they came up with reasons for, well, what about comets and shooting stars? Those are all within the range of the moon to us, it was thought, okay? These things move, and they move from this one, because back here where God is, anybody know what term Aristotle used to refer to God? Primum mobile, the prime mover, or the first mover. God himself, itself, however you want to describe God, is immovable. That is, nothing acts on God. God acts on everything else. And God starts this one moving. And what does that do? That makes this one move, and that makes this one move, so that by the time you get down to this, you have the influence of all these other spheres acting upon it, and they all act upon Earth. What is this the basis of? That we still have around us today? Astrology, the horoscope. Because the planets move, the stars move, and when you are born, under what planet, what star, whether it's ascending, descending, has an influence on our lives. It was thought. Okay? A lot of people today still think that. One of the things you'll see in Shakespeare is even before 1610, you'll have Shakespeare saying, let me rephrase that. You'll have a character in some of the plays saying, what a bunch of hooey. Usually they're villains. One of Shakespeare's great villains, Edmund and King Lear, will say, so-and-so says I'm this way because I was born. He goes, no, I'm just a rotten bastard. Or Iago in Othello. He just revels in his rottenness. Okay? So this, as opposed to this, is pretty important, because one of the things that comes as a result of this, see, in this, what's the center of the universe? And what's the highest thing on earth? With this, we're no longer the center of the universe, and we, humanity, are not necessarily, Copernicus did not say this, and Galileo did not say this, and we are not therefore necessarily the highest form of creation. This eventually leads to, and this is the correct view, obviously, to we're nothing but a speck in the grand totality. I think it's either this class, might have been another class. I mentioned the other day the Fermi paradox. Enrico Fermi, famously with a bunch of other physicists, asked one day, they were sitting around lunch, he said, if there's all this other intelligent life out there, how come we've never met them? If there's billions upon billions of galaxies, and remember, he did not have the benefit of the James Webb Space Telescope. I kind of wonder what Einstein and these others would think with having that. Where is everybody? Why are we seemingly alone? Well, those are questions. Is this all there is? Hamlet's going to tell Horatio, there is more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. Because Horatio is a Stoic. What did the Stoics believe? This is it. This is all there is. You live, you die, that's it. No consciousness, no afterlife, the end. Hamlet's like, not so much, okay? And that's before he sees his father's ghost, okay? Okay, Shakespeare, quickly. We'll be lucky if we open the play. I said the other day, he's born April 23rd, 1564. He dies April 23rd, 1616. Okay? In November of 1582, he marries Anne Hathaway. How old is he? He was born in April of 64. November of 82, 64 to 82, he's 18 and a half. Anne Hathaway's 26. Okay. To be, this isn't my opinion, this is Elizabethan mindset, okay? Try to get yourself in that mindset now so that you don't get offended by things I say. I'll tell you when to get offended because I'll intentionally be offensive. To be 26 and unmarried in 1582, spinster, something wrong with her, okay? But they married. And in May of 1583, their daughter, Susanna, is born. Do the math. That's only 6 months later. She's not a preemie. Okay? It's a shotgun wedding. There are no marriage registers from the county of Warwickshire, where Stratford is, that records their wedding, their marriage. According to, I'll put his name down in case you want to look him up. I find this so fascinating. Michael Wood. I used to require this book. Haven't in quite a while. In Search of Shakespeare. It's a great biography because it's written for everybody. It's not written for pointy-headed, egg-headed English professors. He shows fairly conclusively that William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway married in a nearby county, but they did it without what are called the banns being read. The banns is part of English tradition or custom. When a couple are going to get married, I think it's each Sunday for 3 weeks prior to the marriage. Okay? The priest of the church, rector, parson, whatever, stands up in the church and says, Will and Anne are going to be wed on such and such a date. If there is anyone who knows any cause for why they should not be married, let him speak now. How's the rest of it go? Or forever hold his peace or speech. Okay? That wasn't part of the wedding ceremony. That was part of what's called the banns, the announcements. Okay? And that was required. Apparently it wasn't for them. Shakespeare probably, this is entirely opinion and speculation by not just me, other scholars, probably, slipped a few notes to the priest at a nearby county and got the banns not read and secretly wed her, okay? Shakespeare's family is an old family from Warwickshire. Anne's family is an old family from Shakespeare. Shakespeare's mother's name was Mary Arden. There's a forest nearby named the Arden Forest. There's going to be Arden Forest in some of Shakespeare's plays. I think it's As You Like It. Yeah, in As You Like It, probably named after that and stuff, okay? So they get married. Their daughter Susanna is born 6 months later, okay? She goes on to marry a local doctor, has children, etc. In 1585, they're twins. Hamnet, not Hamlet. Hamnet and Judith are born. Okay? We've got baptismal certificates and I think birth certificates for all 3 children. And then from 1585 to 1592, and this is in your introduction, he labels this section, the dark years. I like this phrase better. Roughly 85 to 92 are what are called the lost years. Why? Well, for these, we have documentary evidence. We have references on paper to Shakespeare. Okay? From 1585 to 92, It's like Shakespeare disappears from the face of the earth. There are no references to him at all. There are all kinds of speculations as to what he was doing. One idea is that he was a headmaster of a school. Okay? He had no university education. He did not attend Oxford or Cambridge. Why? Why do we know that? Because he doesn't show up on any rolls. And we have the rolls, actually. Okay? So that's one idea. Another one is that he was an actor in a traveling company. There are a lot of traveling companies, and we have for many of them, we have the names of actors who traveled in them. Shakespeare doesn't show up in any of them. Okay? Another one is that he traveled on the continent. And there are reasons for suspecting that. Shakespeare definitely, we know, knew French. How did he learn it? He didn't go to university. Did he learn it on the continent? One of the ways we know that is one of the sources for A Midsummer Night's Dream is by a guy named Belforest, who wrote only in French, and it had not been translated into English. Shakespeare also knew Greek and Latin, because some of his source material at the time was only available in Greek and Latin. And because Ben Jonson tells us Shakespeare knew, though he knew but little Greek and less Latin. Little Greek and less Latin, okay? So he knew some. What else? He was working as a secretary for some important person. Again, no record of it. All we do know is that in 1592, Shakespeare is referred to, this is in your book, Introduction, Roman numeral LXI. Shakespeare is alluded to by Robert Greene in his pamphlet, A Groat's Worth of Wit and something like 1,000 of Remembrance, okay? Where Greene is lambasting these young, upstart, snot-nosed writers who haven't paid their dues to earn the acclaim that is due him. He's jealous. He's also dying. He dies in September of 1592. And on this page, you'll see the passage from this Groat's Worth of Wit. And Bevington then goes and compares a part of that, where he talks about a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, how that's a modified quote from one of Shakespeare's Henry VI plays, which tells us by the time Greene quotes that, Shakespeare's that particular play has already, at the very least, been performed. May not have been published, but it has been performed, because there's no other way he could have heard that line. Okay? And you have to bear in mind, writers in this time period had excellent memories. You know, they weren't plagued with these. Because often what they would do is they'd go to theaters, they'd go to other places, and they would listen to what other people say, and then go home and write it down. No plagiarism laws. No copyright laws. So you can take somebody else's stuff and put it off as your own. There are what are called foul papers of Shakespeare. They're not Shakespeare's handwriting. Foul copies of some of his plays. It's not that some of those are memorial reconstructions. That is, an actor from a competing acting company buys a ticket to the Globe. They go in, they watch a play, or multiple actors. They memorize what they hear, they go back and they write it all down as fast as they can. They obviously don't get it all, which is why those versions are corrupt, okay? So, 1585 to 92, we don't know what he's doing. It's more than likely that he's begun writing by 1590. A couple of his plays, on the basis of language and such, Titus Andronicus, I think, Comedy of Errors, probably date from right around 1590. The three Henry VI plays, I think, pretty much are all dated prior to 1592. Okay. So he's in London probably by 1590. We don't know where. There are no records of where he lived at that time. We do have other records a little bit later on. Why? Because once the Lord Chamberlain's men, the company that we know Shakespeare was part of, kind of starts doing well. See, Shakespeare's not just an artiste. He's also a capitalist. He starts buying property. He starts getting involved in lawsuits. That's how we know some of what Shakespeare was doing. Okay? We have six, I think it is, 6 signatures by Shakespeare. 2 or 3 of them are on wills, his own, modified wills, and the other 3 or 4 have to deal with lawsuits and property purchases. Okay? 1596, Hamlet dies. It's only 11. Hamlet's in Stratford. From everything we know, Shakespeare's still in London. Okay? Family doesn't move to London, as far as we know. That is, there's no evidence that suggests they moved to London. In 1598, Shakespeare is referred to by another writer as a sonneteer. The guy refers to Shakespeare's sugared sonnets, meaning his sweet little poems. Should mention, I don't have it in here, 1595, 1596, maybe 94 to 96, I don't remember the exact dates. All the playhouses are closed because of plague. Okay? It's a good time to pick up some other writing. He's probably begun his sonnets when I was doing prep work for the sonnet course I was going to teach this semester. Came across some things that suggest some of his earliest sonnets are probably from around 1592, 93. Some of them we know aren't until after 1600. Okay? In 1599, I need to mention something about the Globe Theater. Back up a little bit. In 1575, a guy named James Burbage builds a playhouse, a building for plays in a town of London, area of London called Shoreditch. Okay? He builds it on leased land. So he owns the building, but the land the building is on is only leased. That's in 1575. In 1599, the lease comes due. It ends. So there's a choice to be made. James Burbage is dead by this point. I got to look up there because he had a son named Richard. And Richard was one of the actors in the actors company that Shakespeare was part of. Okay? So, Shakespeare's group hire movers. And they literally dismantle the name of this building that Burbage builds is named the Theater. That's it. It's the first one named the Theater. Okay? There are other playhouses. They dismantle the theater and they move it south of the River Thames in the Southwark district. Really close to where Shakespeare's Globe is today on the south bank of the Thames. Shakespeare's Globe today is about a quarter mile away from its original location. All right? And they rebuild it and they rename it. Now it's called the Globe. So that when Henry V begins, the prologue comes out, the guy speaking the prologue, and talks about this wooden O, which gives us an idea of the shape of the globe. And there are pictures from, drawings from the early 17th century, 1602, 1610, etc., that show the globe. They show the globe, they show the swan, they show a couple of the other playhouses on the south side of the Thames. The south side is outside the city control of London. The Lord Mayor of London has no control over what happens on the south side. See, in 95, 96, I mentioned the playhouses were closed. They were closed by the Mayor of London. Mayor of London often was Puritan. The playhouse, I mean, we know what kind of stuff happens there. People celebrate raunchy behavior. You know, there's sex and violence and all this kind of stuff that shouldn't be happening. Okay? So they rebuilt the globe. 1601, Shakespeare's father, John, dies. In the late 1590s, I think it's 1599 or 1600, Shakespeare is able to secure for his father a coat of arms, which makes him a gentleman, even though he's already been mayor of Stratford. He was mayor of Stratford early in Shakespeare's life, but then he kind of fell out of favor and didn't do so well. He was a glove maker, by the way. 1609, the sonnets are published. 1613, the Globe burns down during a production of Henry VIII. Shakespeare has moved by this point. It's around 1611 or so. Shakespeare goes back to Stratford. Okay. Burns down during a production of Henry VIII where they fire off a cannon. The wadding from the blank goes out of the barrel, lands on the thatched roof, and whoom. If you go to the Globe today, it does have a thatched roof. I was there in 95 when they were still building it, got to take a tour of it. Within the thatch, the layer of thatch in the roof of the Globe today is a sheet metal layer, so that if the top catches fire, it'll stop. Not sheet metal like little thin. This is like, if I remember, it's quarter or half inch thick. Can't transfer the heat, okay? The rest of the Globe was built literally according to all the original specs and standards. They did use some modern tools. A lot of the tools were exact same way, and they've made it so that it accommodates modern bodies because we're larger and heavier than they were in Shakespeare's day, okay? Shakespeare dies, 1616, and 7 years later, a group of his friends and former castmates have published what is called the First Folio. Folio, mine's at home. The First Folio is, if you look at this book, it's about this high by about that wide by more like the thickness of your books. I have no idea why you guys' books are so much thicker than mine. There's not more plays. Anyways, it's the First Folio. That is the first printing of 20 of Shakespeare's plays. He wrote entirely by himself 37 plays. He assisted on 2 others, which is why you'll see some editors who will talk about the 39 plays he wrote. He wrote 154 sonnets, and he wrote 4 really long poems, several hundred lines. He did all of that within a span of roughly 23 years. Just leave the sonnets and plays out. 37 plays in 23 years, that's like a play and a half a year. These aren't, little 1-act plays. These aren't 3-act plays. These are 5 Shakespearean, these are full Shakespearean plays, about 1.5 a year. And I can send you a chronology, and you can see some of these. I mean, it's just boom, 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 like 1600 to 1606. All of the major tragedies, and a couple of comedies. Most of the comedies are from the 1590s. How? I shouldn't go there. One last question we have to address. Was Shakespeare Shakespeare? Yeah, this. Okay. I answered a questionnaire from a publisher a few years ago. I think it was Broadview. Because they knew I taught this course, and it was like, do you address the authorship question? The authorship question, can I get rid of this? Does everybody have all this? Hope so. The anti-Stratfordian movement, or group, whatever, essentially is the belief that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire could not have written the plays attributed to William of Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire. And there's generally one reason why people argue that. Anybody know what it is? Wild guess.
didn't have an educated background, therefore he couldn't know Greek, Latin, French, yada, 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 or how nobility works.
Exactly. He didn't have a good enough education in order to do that. He was not, in other words, what's called a university wit. He was not university trained. Okay? Which is true, he wasn't. From what we assume, because there's no proof, Shakespeare more than likely attended what's called the King Edward VI School in Stratford. It's a grammar school. What we think of as a grammar school. It goes up to about 6th grade. Okay? We assume he attended it because his name doesn't show up there. But his father was the mayor of the town. It's pretty safe to assume that he did. If you go to the King Edward VI School and you get there on one of the lucky days when they open it for visitors, my family and I were there in 2013, and we were walking around Stratford, and door opened up, and would you like to get? Hell yes, because every other time I'd been to Stratford, couldn't get inside. And we go in, and you get in this great hall, central teaching hall, and they've got a plaque over on the wall here, and according to tradition, this is where Shakespeare sat. So of course, I go plop my butt down there, and my kids go plop down there, and blah blah blah. Okay. So what kind of education would he have had? He would have started at somewhere around the age of 6 or 7. He would have gone through the age of 12 to maybe 13. And he would have learned there Latin and Greek. Most of the lessons would have been conducted in Latin. He would not have had a course in English literature. It would have been the old quadrivium and trivium. Grammar, meaning Latin, philosophy, arithmetics, music, geometry, history, theology, etc. Okay? In beginning with the first year classes, he would learn Latin first, but then, the next several years would have been in Latin. And the Latin was taught so that, by the time of his ending, before he left the school, a teacher would say, okay, here you have a passage of Caesar's Gallic Wars. Here's what a student would have to do. Translate that into English. So they'd pull out their slate, they'd have the passage in Latin, translate that, or it'd be on a board, translate that into English. All right? Teacher would come around, look at it. If it wasn't a good translation, rap on the knuckles with a stick, okay? That's only the first part. The second part, the harder part, is, okay, now translate your translation in English back into Latin without the Latin original. They had to match perfectly in order to be considered a success. Shakespeare would have left that school with as much Latin and Greek knowledge and understanding as someone who graduates from Sewanee today with a classics major. That is 4 years of college level, Latin and Greek. He would have known by the age of 12 or 13. So how come Ben Jonson says, though Shakespeare had little Latin and less Greek? Because Jonson means that compared to me, Ben Jonson. And Ben Jonson had a lot of Latin and more Greek. Ben Jonson was a classicist. Nobody knew more Latin and Greek than Ben Jonson at that point. Okay? But the anti-Stratfordians say, yeah, but it wouldn't have been enough. And how would he have come to understand the mindsets of nobles? How could he have entered into the mind of Henry V? Or Henry V, right after he becomes king, and he's walking around the encampment getting ready for a battle, listening to his people, and then speaking in disguise to them. Only a nobleman could have understand the gravitas of that kind of sentiment, is the argument. One other thing about this. Who do you think, or who do these anti-Stratfordians say, okay, if Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare, who was he? Usually one name comes up more than anybody else. Francis Bacon. He's an aristocrat. He's not really royal, but he's an aristocrat, and he's brilliant. He was the smartest man of his age. Okay? But there's no proof. None at all. One of the arguments the anti-Stratfordians use is Shakespeare dies in 1660. Where's all the commendatory verse? Where are all the commemorations of his death? See, when other poets, writers died, people would get together and they'd publish a pamphlet or a book celebrating this person's life. Here's another guy named Edmund Carey, a little minor poet. A couple of years after his death, these guys produced this slim, about 100-page volume of poetry about him. Where's Shakespeare's? How come it takes 7 years? The anti-Stratfordians say it's because it took them 7 years to get the conspiracy all worked out. Okay? Personally, what a load of nonsense. But a lot of major English literary people were/are anti-Stratfordians. George Bernard Shaw, Arthur Conan Doyle, Oliver Wendell Holmes, United States well, that doesn't really mean much, Supreme Court Justice. The first artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe in London, Mark Rylance. He's been up for a couple of Oscars over the last few years. He was the first artistic director. He was there from 1995 to 2005. He has this book called Play. It's like this tall, that wide, about that thick. It's about the first 10 years of the Globe as his job as artistic director. The first page of the introduction, he says Shakespeare didn't write these. And I'm like, no! Because, my opinion, you go to the Globe today and it's crappy. The productions are just crappy because they're filled, I shouldn't go there, with all kinds of woke nonsense. I mean, they're trying to find sex and gender and where it's not. And there's a lot of that in Shakespeare. But anyways, get on the Daily Telegraph website and there's an article about the latest production of the Globe. Read the comments by people who go to the Globe. And they just, flamethrower to it, right? So, I had to mention it so that you're aware of it. Vast majority of English scholars say this is just a load of tosh. It's nonsense. 3 minutes to talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream. So I'll do this part real quickly. It's a romantic comedy, obviously. 2 main settings. Only 2. Okay? You've got Athens and the wood. The play opens in Athens, and you have the first 2 scenes in Athens, and then you move to a wood outside Athens. Notice the majority of the play occurs in the wood or forest outside of Athens. What are the 2 settings conveying? What are they signifying? What happens in them? Well, even without talking about this, Athens. You mentioned the word Athens, and what does it immediately connote? Okay, 1, Greece. What else? Democracy. What else? Birthplace of Western civilization in one sense. Order, rule, class, class meaning greatness, arrangement in order, law. Okay? The wood conveys what? How many of you have read much of Nathaniel Hawthorne? Anybody? Well, part of me says good, and part of me says, well, that's not good. Young Goodman Brown, one of his short stories, set in the Northeast, and what happens in it? During the day, you got these fine, upright pilgrims, Puritans, going about their daily business, Goodman Gray and good women, blah, blah, blah. And what do they do at night? They go off in the woods and celebrate with Satan. The wood is wild. It's unruly. It's where law doesn't hold sway. The wood is where there is chaos, misrule, fairies. It's uncivilized. So, what is Shakespeare doing? those two images get juxtaposed. Where's the misrule? Where's the chaos? Is it merely in these places? Or is it also in here? I mean, the play opens with a conflict. What's the conflict? Hermia says, I don't want to marry Lysander. I want to marry Demetrius. And her father says, or do I have that backwards?
Backwards.
Her father says, no, you're right. Her father says, I want you to marry Demetrius, not Lysander. Ooh, what's the problem there? Who the hell does she think she is, speaking like that to her father? Because in ancient Greece, again, you have to enter into the mindset. So, last thing. Enter into the mindset of the 16th, early 17th century as we read Shakespeare's play, but then also try, and we can't do it fully, and I don't even know that we can do it halfway. Try to enter into the mindset of the time period of the play. At the very least, this is 5th century or earlier Greece, 5th century BC. It's probably more like 1000 BC. What kind of rights do women have? Yeah.
What rights?
None. What rights? What rights do men have?
A lot.
To some extent, only citizens. Slaves don't have any. Okay. Who's got the most rights of all? Theseus,
The Duke.
the Duke. Okay. All right. We'll stop there. And I say I'm going to try and do all of Midsummer Night's Dream on Tuesday. Have it all read. I'm going to put up a quiz today or tomorrow, might be Saturday. I'm going to put up a quiz. The first one will be an extra credit to give you an idea of what the quizzes will look like. 10, 15 points maybe. From when I put it up to when it'll be due will probably be about 4 days. So there'll be a 4-day window. The quiz itself, you'll have 10 or 15 minutes. Okay? I'll post that announcement on D2L, and there will be something in the calendar on the right side of your homepage for this class on D2L that'll tell you upcoming assignments. Okay? All right, we'll stop there and try to do all of it.